Welcome to the Roundtable Perspective. I'm your host, Tom Roach. I'm joined today by my guest, Dr. Maria Belodubrovskaya. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me.
Maria's here to talk to us about two of her books, one that just came out and one that's going to come out, about the history of film in Soviet Russia. And tell us about those two books and what each of them covers.
So the first book is called Not According to Plan, Filmmaking Under Stalin, and it deals with film production during the Stalin period in Soviet Russia, and the Stalin period was between 1930 to 1953.
Yeah.
It's called Not According to Plan because the argument in the book is that things did not go according to plan in Soviet Russia, and it's kind of a pun on planning, central planning and economic planning, which in this particular case did not work out for Stalin as he wanted. So, and the basic idea here is that there's a standard story about what happened under Stalin. So, because Stalinist regime was a totalitarian regime, or an authoritarian regime,
Yeah.
the idea is that anyone who worked under this regime served the state. There are even books that are called, Serving the State, films that were made under this regime served the state, and filmmakers who worked under this regime served the state. And the only way that one could resist the regime was to do something that goes completely against it, and in that case, you get punished, you get killed, you get sent abroad, and so on and so forth.
You go off to a
right.
gulag
so
with Solzhenitsyn, right?
So so the idea is that there are only two options: either you are out and you're resisting, or you're working for the state.
And you have a different take on this.
Yes, and my book suggests that the devil is in the details, and it all depends on what the institutions are, who the filmmakers are, and what the institutions are. And so in this case, what Stalin wanted, which was 1,000 political masterpieces, ended up not happening. What ended up happening is film production shrunk to about 10 films a year in the 1950s. And the question is, how did that happen, given that what Stalin wanted didn't happen?
Yeah.
And my argument is it's who the filmmakers were and what the filmmaking institutions, the actual processes and practices that were making the films.
And that's the two books. So one is on the film industry, and the other is on the films that were being produced, right?
So the first book is on directors, production planning, screenwriting, and censorship.
Yeah.
So how these things were organized and what led to the reduction in the number of films.
Yeah.
And the second book is on the films. And there the standard story is that the films were propaganda.
Yeah.
As long as the films were produced under the Stalinist regime, they must be propaganda. They should be looked at as propaganda. They should be studied as that. And what I argue is that they're much more interesting than propaganda. If you simply change the perspective and look at them as normal films, you find out that they're primarily popular international genre films and not propaganda films.
Well, and you have an important perspective on this because you have your Ph.D. from University of Wisconsin, right?
Right.
But you have 2 degrees also, which you received in Russia, so you've got to look at it from both sides of the Iron Curtain, as they say, right? And so you found that the film industry in Russia was a little more independent than people thought it was.
Exactly.
And you're basically saying that we need to take another look at this. Am I right?
It's actually interesting that you mentioned my degrees because the idea of this book goes back to when I was a student at VGIK, which is the Moscow Film School. And there, as part of my training, I watched Soviet movies from this period. And I came to this period with the same exact understanding that everything was controlled by Stalin and the films were propaganda.
Yeah.
And then I'm watching some of these films, and some of them have nothing to do with Stalinism, have nothing to do with the ideology at the time. And so my question immediately was, how is that possible? That
if there was that much
if
control.
there's so much control, if Stalin reads every script, if Stalin watches every movie, if everyone is working for the state, how is it possible that you get films that are so much more interesting than that?
And this theory about Stalin controlling everything was around for years, but nobody actually looked to see what Stalin actually did, right? And I understand you investigated that.
Yes, there's a very famous book called Kremlevsky Censor, or the Kremlin Censor, which argues that Stalin was intimately involved with Soviet film production. In particular, the claim there is made that Stalin read many screenplays that
Yeah.
Soviet films were made based on. But nobody actually ever counted how many screenplays Stalin read. I have gone to the archives
Yeah.
and tried to trace how many, and they're all listed. They're sitting there in the archive in Moscow, and they're about 10, maybe 15.
Yeah.
And the Soviet Union at the time, this period 1930 to 1953, produced 600 films. So
Yeah.
first of all, the percentage of films that Stalin was intimately involved
Yeah, I'm
in,
calculating 6%.
very, very low, very, very low.
Yeah.
And moreover, what he said about these films is extremely limited. So my favorite story from my archival research is when I went to this archive, which is hard to get to, is an archive of social political history, and I got to the Stalin,
Yeah.
papers, and I
Yeah.
got these screenplays, and I'm sitting over them, and the screenplay I'm looking at says, there's 3 notes by Stalin in red pencil, which he was famous for, and one says, good. Look at pages 15 and 67, and you look at pages 16 and 77, what he did is he crossed out the word Koba, which was his political pseudonym, which was too informal, and said Stalin instead. That's the amount of corrections and censorship
Yeah.
that he did. And many screenplays, every single screenplay that I looked at had this kind of marginalia, very limited
Yeah.
involvement.
Now, there were some things that got censored during this period, I'm sure, right?
Yes,
How,
yes.
how would that happen?
So there was censorship of every screenplay and every film, right? So every film went to, every screenplay went to a censor, and the comments were issued, and the screenwriters had to adjust the screenplay. The same happened with films.
So it just wasn't Stalin doing the censoring?
Yes, but the thing is, Stalin was never involved in the screenplay at the screenplay stage. Sometimes people would send him screenplays because they were his personal patrons, like Alexander Dovzhenko, the Ukrainian filmmaker, considered Stalin his own patron, and so he would send screenplays to him for this reason. There's even a story of Dovzhenko reading his screenplay of one of his films out loud to Stalin. That did happen.
Yeah.
Not that Stalin changed anything about the screenplay. And so what happened was that Stalin never interfered on the level, at the pre-production stage, which is screenplay. What he would do is he would watch the films later on.
Yeah.
And based on his reactions, is he laughing?
Yeah.
Is he unhappy? Is he
Yeah.
grunting? Is he
Yeah.
saying bad words? The decision was made whether Stalin liked the film or not, and then this decision was distributed to newspapers, and newspapers accordingly wrote reviews, whether positive or negative, based on that kind of thing.
So there was
But
a
it was,
heavy hand
yes,
there,
but it
yes.
was a heavy, so what I call Stalin in my book, and this is not just my idea, others have mentioned that, is he was the chief audience.
Yeah.
He was the chief audience.
Yeah.
He was the one of the main audiences. Whereas in commercial industries, film industries, you have an audience, which is the people who will vote for your film with ticket sales, like ticket purchases.
Yeah.
In Russia, there were 3 audiences. One audience was Stalin, one audience was audience, and the third one was the filmmakers who were watching the films.
Yeah.
So
And
you
had their
kind of
own
had to
culture,
satisfy. Yes, so you had to satisfy. If you think about it this way, you had to satisfy those 3 audiences and not just one.
That's interesting. For people who aren't familiar with Russian history, basically Stalin bridges the gap between Lenin and Khrushchev.
Yes.
And Khrushchev being the person who was
Bridges the gap
debating
or
Nixon in the
explodes the
kitchen
gap.
and things like that, right? Now, when you saw these movies expecting them to be heavily,
Censored.
infused with propaganda and censored, what did you see that surprised you?
So the films were experimental in form. So they were not conservative in terms of their style. And the idea is that Russian cinema arrived on the world stage in the 20s with people like Sergei Eisenstein, Vsevolod Pudovkin, and so on, who made extremely experimental films. Their films were narrative, they're storytelling films, but they were experimental in form. They used montage, they did all kinds of things that made these films modernist, difficult to watch. And the conventional wisdom is Stalin comes along and the films become very conservative, very classical in their structure. And that is not at all the case. What, in particular, for the second book, one of the chapters in this book is going to be about plotting of Soviet films, how Soviet films were plotted, what was the plot like. And whether you expect Soviet films to have conventional plots, like classical Hollywood cinema, which is you have a character who has goals, who pursues these goals. There's a romantic couple involved, things like that. And
something complicates things.
Something very, yes. So
they have a
there's
meet-cute
suspense.
scene,
yes, there's meet cute, there's suspense, there's surprise, there's curiosity, these kinds of things.
Yeah.
And this kind of film is very easy to absorb. And it's very easy to slip into it some propaganda messages. Under Soviets, they didn't want this kind of film because they thought it was mere entertainment.
Yeah.
It was too easy. It was too bourgeois. It was too much like a Western movie.
Yeah.
And they wanted something different. And so what do you do differently? If you don't have a classical plot, what can you do? So the alternative is you make films that are catalogs of statements, like rhetorical films, or you can do chronology, so you just recount events, or you do descriptive things. So you just describe something. So there's no story, there's no interest. But the problem with that is that it's much harder for audiences to get attached to these kinds of movies. So it's like there was an ideological decision made that we don't want to make films like Hollywood. We're going to make different films. But it is also the case that in this different mode, which is more experimental in terms of plot, it is much harder to slip in messages because the audiences are having trouble figuring out the story.
Well, that's interesting because Vladimir Lenin, right, was one of the first world leaders to realize the impact that film can have, right? I mean, I think you mentioned three things that he realized that it could go out to a mass audience.
Right.
And he also, one of the things he also realized was that it spoke to people who weren't necessarily literate.
Exactly.
So he could reach more people with it, and then of course he could put messages in it.
Right.
So it would seem that from his perspective, he would want films to be more accessible, but the film industry, you're saying, ended up being less accessible than he would have wanted.
Because there's a conflict, there's conflict. So Lenin very much understood that you need to have there's a Leninist proportion. It's famous in literature, the Leninist proportion.
Really?
Give them 75% entertainment, 25% newsreels and stuff like that, which is propaganda, right?
Yeah.
So he understood, and Trotsky understood, and I write about Trotsky, who wanted to replace church with cinema, religion with cinema.
Okay.
So they understood that you have to have something that's entertaining. The problem is that under Stalin, there's another ideological need that needs to be satisfied, which is that in the 30s, Soviet Union is the only communist country in the world. So the Soviet Union needs to prove to the rest of the world that everything that it does is better. Yeah. Better agriculture, better economy, better art.
Right.
And so
thus the art competitiveness that we saw through the 70s and 80s. Yeah.
We need to make films that are superior to the West. We cannot just follow Western formulas. We need to fix films that are different and superior to the West. And that hurts that entertainment
But did they have anybody who could tap like Fred Astaire? Huh? Did they?
Of course they did. But that was considered to be too bourgeois.
Yes.
Don't be like Hollywood. One other piece of this story is that Stalin did want a mass cinema.
Yeah.
And there was a project in 1935 to build a Soviet Hollywood in the south of Russia, to have actually a complex that made movies with 40 studios and 200 directors making mass cinema.
Yeah.
And Stalin closes this project down in 1937.
But it actually got going?
Sorry?
It got started?
It got started. Well, the foundation was laid.
Okay.
That's it. It never went anywhere further. Yeah. Because it was too Hollywood, it was too Western, and Stalin got scared. He wanted to have his own way.
So were there, stars during this period in Russia, and they were celebrities?
Yes. My take is you have to look at this cinema as a normal international genre cinema. And if you look at that, you see that there are stars. One example that you can think about is songs. So Russian films had songs, just like American films have songs, or Bollywood has songs, any other. And these are songs that were distributed and produced the same way as any other cinema. So they were written for the film. They captured some idea from the film or the feelings of characters from the film. And they were they had a life after the film. They became very popular, some of them, and they were distributed on the radio. They were sung during birthday parties by people. And so imagine that. Some of these songs had the name Stalin in them, but these were not the most popular ones.
Yeah.
No, you cannot force an audience, a person, to sing a song they don't believe in or they can't sing. I had this experience growing up in Russia when there's a Soviet anthem and you're supposed to sing it, but it was such a lie that you don't sing it. Yeah. So you can't force people to sing songs, right? Think the same way.
Well, they did in China, I think.
Well,
yes.
Maybe you can to some degree. You really have to scare them.
Yeah.
But it's the same with films.
Yeah.
Think that in order for a film to be truly popular, it could not be all propaganda, because then people would not pay to watch it.
Yeah.
So just thinking about it that way, you understand that this cinema was, to a great degree, just a normal cinema.
So these directors and film producers and actors, they saw themselves as artists just like people in the West did,
Yes, they saw themselves as artists first and propagandists second.
Yeah.
Or they would say things like, I write about this in the book, that we are propagandists by means of art, and art comes first.
Yeah.
And what they meant by propaganda was a positive thing. It was education.
Right.
So they themselves could justify their working for the state.
Yeah. Well, the original use of the word, even in English, was not pejorative, right?
It's propagate ideas.
Although we, it's probably the U.S. more than any other country who gave it the negative connotations with the Creel Committee and some other things.
It apparently started around World War I when it gained that connotation. So I don't know the history of that.
Yeah. Well, so are there any, you said things were very experimental during this period. Are there any techniques that were developed in Russian cinema that influenced Western cinema? Did it work the other way at all?
So this cinema was, so there is the 1920s when montage is developed. And montage is fast cutting where the shots that are cut together are not coherent.
Yeah, it's not a linear progression.
Right, not a linear progression of cutting, right? And during the Stalin period, that practice was kind of went away to some degree, but it still continued at a lower level, right? But in every other respect, so other than that montage technique, in every other respect, these films are like Hollywood films, like the best examples of Western cinema, where there's some experimentation, some normal storytelling. The most experimental part of it is the stories that are not classical, to me. That the stories that do not follow a normal, surprise and suspense structure of couple formation. That's the most experimental part.
Now, even during the 50s, right? Some of these movies actually came to the U.S., right? They were shown in New York.
Right. So that's one other thing, is when I say there are three audiences, the regular audiences, filmmakers themselves, and Stalin, the West was also an audience. So every film that was considered good enough and not too terribly propagandistic traveled to the West, and in particular was distributed in New York.
So they were more interested in demonstrating that they could make good movies than they were in spreading propaganda when they were sending them to the US.
And why? So the question is why. The why, it is because the people who were making films were the same people that made films in the 20s. There was so what Stalin should have done, if I was his advisor, I would have said that. Right. He did this to some degree in literature, is fire all the filmmakers that exist and train an army of 1,000 filmmakers who are completely loyal to you. Instead, they make a decision in 1933 to entrust film production to existing artists, to people like Eisenstein, Kuleshov, and others. And this is the people who then make movies under Stalin. And these people are artists, true artists. They're not propagandists. And so this question of how is it possible that Stalin didn't get what he wanted is because he didn't have the people making the films that could have made the films he wanted.
Well, it's, and plus there's just a certain built-in resistance in the art community to taking that kind of direction.
But you can deal with this, right? If you really suppress everyone.
Yeah. Now, is it true that the film industry before the Bolshevik Revolution was really fairly well developed? And tell us a little bit about that.
So there are several film industries in the world. They were highly developed prior to 1930. Not every country had its own film production, but Russia was a big one. France was another one. Hollywood, India had film.
India back then too,
yes,
really?
Yes, very much so. Chinese film industry was very strong, and the Japanese film industry was very strong. So there were several, Germany too, many countries in Europe. And so Russia was just one of those very well-developed local traditions. They started making movies in 1907, almost from the beginning. So by the time that Eisenstein arrives, and by the time Stalin arrives and has some influence, there is a tradition going back 30 years of making films.
Well, so there's probably another reason why it was difficult for him to take control of it, right?
Exactly. What I argue is what people say, there's this avant-garde 1920s, there's a dip when nothing good is happening in the 30s and 40s under Stalin, and then Khrushchev comes around, and there's a new revolutionary change in filmmaking. What I argue is there was a little bit of a dip, but the tradition continued because the people who made films were the same. And that's why we should study these films. That's why we should pay more attention to them.
So it's possible these could be turned into DVDs or they could be available online, but they're not, right? So
one of my goals in life is to write about these films to such a degree that they are then, more people are writing about them, more people are talking about them, and they get released. At the moment, very few films from this period have DVD releases with English subtitles. They're all available online. They're all available in Russian, but not with subtitles. Some of them are on YouTube. But I'm hoping that my work will bring them to international interest, and they will be released. More of them will be released.
So how good are they? What's one of the better films? Describe it for us.
So I recently wrote a little piece for a collection called The Lexicon of Global Melodrama.
Okay.
On a film called Mashenka, which is a diminutive of a name Maria, named after the main protagonist, who's a young woman who falls in love. It's a melodrama. It's from 1942. You would think that under the Stalinist conditions, they didn't make melodramas. This film is completely devoid of politics. The protagonist mentions reading Lenin and not quite getting to Marx yet. But it is all kind of said in this kind of light and jokey manner. There's no party representative. So many of these films from this period have a party representative in the plot. There's like a stock character of a party member who guides the hero. There's nothing like this happening in this film. And this is 1942, in the middle of this period. We have a film which has no politics in it whatsoever. It's a melodrama about a boy and a girl. How is that possible? And many films like this were made. So there's some cult of personality films which are dedicated to saying Stalin was great, but those are very, very few. Most of them are just regular international genre movies.
Okay. And just quickly, what's it like doing research in Russia now? You've gone back, I'm sure, to work on your books.
So it is delightful to do research because you get access to the voices from that period. But it is not the easiest way. It's not the easiest part of this project to do research in Russia, because Russia has these old traditions where they give you a limited number of documents for a limited number of time, and then you have to wait a few days to get another batch of documents. So you actually, if you go to Russia for 2 weeks, you only work in the archive for like 4 days. So it's very time-consuming. But very rewarding. So I wish the Russian archives were a little bit more, much more open than they are right now. But you do what you do what you can.
Yeah. And what are you thinking about doing next? What's your next project?
So I am just working on this second book, and I want to make it as good as possible. I have some other ideas. I also write on Hitchcock. But for book, as far as the book is concerned, it's the second book that is my focus.
Okay. I'm just curious, your interest in Hitchcock, do you think he's a bit of a propagandist for the West, or is that a totally different interest?
Well, that's what I'm trying to tell a different story. So I've been teaching Hitchcock for years, and it seems like Hitchcock is very much misunderstood.
Well, that's very good. And if anybody wants to know more about this, they can take a class with Maria at University of Chicago, where she's an associate professor. That's all the time we have for our program. Thank you to Maria Belodubrovskaya for joining us today on the Roundtable Perspective. I'm Tom Roach. See you next time.